good morning and good afternoon and evening to our friends and colleagues from across the world. It's a really great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on nurturing post-growth alternatives in the bioeconomy. My name is Rachel Weinberg, and I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar, which forms part of a series we're running linked to our program that's titled Rethinking Biodiversity-Based Economies for Conservation and Equity. Some of you may have participated in earlier webinars and in our recent sessions, which were focused on sharing experiences between South Africa and Brazil. So this program has 4 themes: on governance, on science and equity, and on conservation, and then the 4th one is on post-growth. And today I'm really delighted to introduce the first of what we're hoping is going to be a series of webinars that's centered on post-growth alternatives to the bioeconomy and more broadly to biodiversity-based economies. So I think it's really timely given that the bioeconomy has increasingly taken center stage in recent years as a response to the polycrises that we face and as a way that we can enable sustainable transitions away from fossil fuels. So in fact, South Africa's current leadership of the G20 has a very strong focus on the bioeconomy, building on a set of high-level principles that were developed by Brazil in its prior G20 leadership. But as you will hear today, these framings and the visions that they assume comprise a very divergent set of worldviews and contexts, which typically embrace sort of a vision of a bioeconomy which is in support of unlimited economic growth and of capitalism. So it's a very promissory discourse. It's one that sees technologies, and especially biotechnologies, as a way in which society will progress, or how the processing and the upgrading of biological raw materials and the establishment of new value chains will lead us to sort of this imaginary, sustainable new world. So, of course, I mean, some elements of technology, of course, are useful and important, but we really need to also take a step back and ask about the outcomes and the kind of society that we want to achieve. And ultimately, how economic activity can be rethought to enable more relational approaches that resist sort of these extractivist logics, which are such a huge crisis in our world, and a future that's based on reconnecting people with nature. So I'm really excited to hear how our 3 speakers are going to see this future unfold. Some housekeeping remarks before we move on to the speakers. Please do put your questions or your comments in the chat, which is open. These will be actively gathered by my colleagues throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to pose them to the speakers, although we may not manage to respond to all of them. So please choose to send to everyone when you select in the chat, so that our team can read them. And if you want your name and affiliation to be used, please include those so we can acknowledge you properly when we read out your question. We will record the webinar and we'll make it available later on our website, where you can find the recordings of all the other webinars as well of this series. So without any further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Sabrina Shakori from the University of Sydney in Australia. And she is an interdisciplinary researcher, educator, and award-winning social entrepreneur. She's a research fellow at the University of Sydney, and her work explores how to catalyze transitions towards post-growth societies. And she's especially interested in X-innovation as a way to unlock systemic change. She's also the founder of the Brisbane Tool Library and a co-founder of the Degrowth Journal. So welcome, Sabrina, and we really look forward to your presentation.
So thanks everyone for being here today. We are talking about degrowth, post-growth today, but I just thought that, we should probably go back to the root and understand why a growth-driven society is the problem. So I usually like to reflect on this question: how could we create unsustainable society? Increasing resource consumption, overusing soils, polluting waters, disrupting, climate cycles, losing biodiversity, increasing malnutrition above ends of the spectrum, widening inequalities. If this was our to-do list, then unfortunately we are on track in achieving almost all of these objectives. And the science has been clear for a long time. We had an update on the planetary boundaries. We live in a polycrisis that sees several social and ecological crises happening at the same time. And again, I will not go today into the details of these studies, but all the authors of these studies, such as for this one, are calling for urgent action towards some kind of change to shift us towards more sustainable societies. If we look at, again, at the Global Resource Outlook published last year by the UN, they show that if we do not change, for example, we will see the resource use up by 60% from 2020 level by 2060, meaning again that we're gonna, need resources and energy to keep our economy going. And again, their conclusion is always the same. We urgently need to transform society towards sustainable status. But let's firstly understand what a growth-driven economy is. And today I will really give just a brief overview because I'm the first of the three panelists. We live in a growth-driven economy that basically aims at an infinite expansion of production and consumption. And we capture that with this indicator, which is the gross domestic product, GDP. And GDP measures all the kind of market transaction every time we buy or sell and exchange a good or service, but it omits so many other activities, such as non-market ones, such as volunteering, caring for children, elders, etc. A standing forest has no value, but if we cut it and turn it into furniture, it has a value. If you cycle and go to your local farmer markets, you're not contributing to GDP as much as if you were driving your car. So I always, ironically and sadly, say to people, if you want to increase GDP and foster the growth of the economy, maybe you can have a car accident on your way back from a supermarket. A car accident would need, car repairing. Maybe you can even end up in hospital and so on. And all of this negative activity increase indeed GDP. So when we start understanding what this indicator account for, we can understand and start unraveling the dysfunctional parts of our economic system. And the limits of GDP and of this economic system are well studied. And here I put a quote of the UN Secretary General where, again, mentioning GDP, he says we're destroying nature and we are counting it as increased wealth. And the problem with the growth-driven economy is that no matter how much we consume and produce, it's never enough because the growth is a policy objective nowadays. And the economy came up with all kinds of mechanisms to keep fostering economic growth, such as planned obsolescence. So products have been designed since the 70s and 80s with planned obsolescence in mind, meaning that their durability is decreased so that consumers have to replace them more often, which basically means we need more energy and resources to produce products. But we also have intra-industry trade, so countries import and export the same goods. For example, the US buys beef from some countries and exports their own beef to other countries. So we came up with all kinds of mechanisms to keep GDP growing. In response to this, one solution is the bioeconomy, and today's we will hear also the other panelists' perspectives and studies on this. But in Australia, the bioeconomy as a term is not really central. We can see, and I took some recent screenshot from government pages, that we tend to use here in Australia different terminology, such as nature repair markets, net zero economies, nature-based solution, bioenergy, circular economy. So there's a lot of terms used to indicate some kind of sustainability pathways. However, what all of these terms that I just showed you right now have in common is that in this spectrum of sustainability transition, they sit in the hopeful and palliative end. So this is a spectrum created by Morrison and colleagues. And basically, the hopeful and palliative mechanisms are those that rely on technocratic solutions. So technology as the main and only way of solving the polycrisis that we are living, and also market-based solutions. So often these mechanisms imply that nature needs to be commodified in order to be protected. At the other end of this spectrum, Morrison and colleagues call for more attention to deep, radical, and strategic solution. And they write that deep, radical intervention address the root drivers of, for example, climate change, and therefore require overturning the socio-economic system in place, which is the capitalist system. And they point out that de-growth and post-growth policies as a way to indeed have a more systemic transformation. In a study with my colleague Katrina Billy and I, equally, we looked at sustainable development narrative. And unfortunately, the conclusion of our study was, again, that technocentric view, although they are well studied and the limits of focusing our development pathway just on technological advances are well researched, the limits of these solutions, sorry. But so they, nevertheless, these technocentric views remain central. However, with some shy hope, we saw that there are also more and more studies advancing scientific pluralism, looking at ways that not only advance technological solution, but also study and develop socioeconomic transformation. So when we talk about socioeconomic transformation today, the most prominent that I focus on in my work is degrowth and post-growth. And post-growth really is about an equitable downscaling of production and consumption so that we can prioritize social and ecological well-being over profit and growth at all costs. And an important part of the definition that I put here is that post-growth and degrowth especially emphasize the need to downscale the economic metabolism of overgrown economies, of rich countries, of those that are and have contributed the most to ecological footprint, inequality, and injustice around the world. Specifically, my research and my interest then focus on how can we do business in a post-growth economy. Obviously, we will still need enterprises to trade goods and services. And in a study with several colleagues, we looked at organizational principles of post-growth enterprises. And probably the main feature is that post-growth enterprises are not-for-profit. The legal structure is really clear. And by being not-for-profit, that allows them to not have competing goals and interests between creating profit or prioritizing social ecological well-being. Not-for-profit organization cannot have a surplus profit, and therefore they reinvest everything in social ecological well-being. So that is a main feature, but as you can see here, and I'm not going through all the table today, there are different also governance and organizational principles as well as production principles that might focus on conviviality, open access technology, relocalization of the economy, and so on. And this is really important because when we think about systemic transformation, we tend to think that, there are so many barriers and then we might not be able to indeed, have new business models that fit planetary boundaries. But my work shows that, post-growth enterprises exist. I analyzed, for example, post-growth food enterprises. And again, I'm not going into this study, but there's the reference there. And we can see that along the food supply chain in Australia, post-growth enterprises exist from production down to the retail space with food cooperatives models, for example. And they all are not-for-profit, and they obviously differ in their barriers and catalyzers, but these can be considered post-growth food enterprises. I'm also the co-founder of the Brisbane Tool Library, which is like a book library, but for tools. So people can borrow tools and other things and objects. And tool libraries around the world are also embody this post-growth enterprises model because they have a plan where communities share resources. Therefore, they give access to resources without, people having to own and purchase their items. And in doing so, they help reducing the ecological footprint of communities. And as I wrote in this slide, without reducing their use rights. So with tool library around the world, we're trying to decrease material consumption, but at the same time enhance the experiences and the access that community can have. And by borrowing and not buying, there's also the potential, and more studies need to investigate this, that tool library might help also reducing inequalities and by taking down the barriers of having to buy items. So today, my focus and my main point is that these niches, these shadow networks, which are networks that operate outside the dominant system and experiment new ways of organizing the economy, exist. And they don't bring just technological innovation, they bring social and political innovation. They find creative ways to reorganize the collective, to reorganize resources in order to build sustainable societies. And the literature around niches bringing forward a new economic system exists and is expanding. Less attention is given to the other part of this graph, the red curve. And this is where my focus is at the moment in research. I'm interested in exploring exnovation. Exnovation is the active planned phase out of unsustainable and undesirable business models, technologies, political structures, political institution, or entire socio-political system if we think more about the political economy. So how can we remove the undesirable elements so that we can remove the barriers to the niches that are indeed putting efforts into developing a new economic system? With Danilo Ruzzedo, a colleague, we looked at exnovation in conservation science and practice. Again, today we will not have time to go into it, but we look at the fact that lots of technologies are developed for other purposes and then translated into conservation and biodiversity projects. And often this technology might be undesirable from a community perspective, or they might bring, they might lead to negative environmental impacts. For example, often drones and cameras are set up in national parks and they end up as e-waste. And then that poses question on who needs to manage the e-waste or other negative effect. So exnovation help us planning and anticipating not only what needs to be phased out and when, but also it invites us to have a more shared responsibility across actors, negotiating that responsibility. So in this case, for example, should producers of technology also be responsible for removing the technologies from the market and for all the waste management costs and processes? So that's an open question, but it's important to think about these things, not only in conservation, but also in other areas. But we don't need to exnovate just technologies. Here, I just put an example. We need to exnovate or phase out of GDP as the main indicator and policy objective of our economic system. And if we look at, at the literature, there are many suggestions of alternative indicators that would help us capture social and ecological well-being instead of simply growth. We could, introduce legislations in countries to avoid the planned obsolescence mechanism so that our products' durability would be extended. In that case, then we would have, for example, again, less waste in our societies. But we can also think about other parts of society that could be exnovated, such as advertisement. And here I put just, again, a quote of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres that called for a ban in advertisement of fossil fuel companies and around, banning or reducing advertisement of, fast fashion and other products, there's a big debate because often the capitalist market says, oh yeah, well, we have the freedom of expression and you can't reduce that. But on the other side, one could also think we should at least increase the importance of freedom of perception. For example, should we be having all these advertisement of private companies in public spaces or in public transport and so on? So these are all questions that could be interesting exploring at a local level to see what can be phased out so that other organizations can then expand, amplify their work. So as I said, exnovation is about phasing out also narrative and cultural practices. And why I specifically think that exnovation requires more attention is that when we look at these, market-driven technocentric solution, often innovation is painted as a win-win solution for all actors. So in transitioning toward a new society, we're all going to be winners. However, exnovation points out at the fact that the interests of some organizations or actors might be deprioritized in a transition. And when we start looking at exnovation, then we go straight into the resistance. Resistance that can come from top-down levels. And here I put a quote of an IPCC report, chapter 17, where they talk very clearly about the fact that there are lobbies undermining national climate objectives in order to keep fossil fuel companies going, for example. So we have across also public health, we have various studies that look at the resistance of top-down actors and organizations. But what's even more interesting when we look at exnovation is that we can also have backlashes and resistance from bottom-up movement. And this happens when, for example, the Yellow Vest movement or the European Union farmers a few years ago, when exnovation happens without taking into account justice element. So of course, then population, which often the most vulnerable are those called to pay and to burden the cost of transition. They might revolt, and then as for the case of the European Union farmers, the result has been that some really ambitious sustainability goals for food system transition in Europe have been changed, and yeah, so. Just to finish, I'm aware of time and that I packed in this presentation a lot, but I would invite all of you to unlearn and undo, either at the macro level or in your own micro world. I invite you to socialize new ideas, in this case, such as post-growth or degrowth, and then to organize with your community around alternative modes of production and consumption. And again, I like to finish with these quotes. One is from Greiber, which says, the collective action which rejects and therefore confronts some form of power domination, and in doing so reconstitutes social relationship, is a very important part of transition. And so the literature again shows that communities are always very resilient in building and rebuilding coalitions. So we do have the human power to indeed transition toward a new economy. And finally, if you have to retain just one thing from all this presentation, is that another world is possible. And yeah, the data, the science is very clear that we need to resist and refuse the growth-driven system and the negative effect caused by it. So I invite all of you to at least keep alive the idea of a non-capitalist society. Thank you.
For a wonderful presentation. They are full of rich ideas and passion and very inspiring. Thank you so much. We're going to hold with questions until the end of the three presentations, but please do post any questions, responses, comments that you have in the chat, and we will get to them. So our next presenter is Professor Sabaheta Ramsilovic Suominen. Excuse me for bad pronunciation. Sabaheta is a research professor and chair of international forest policy and governance who's based at the Natural Resources Institute in Finland. And she's also a teacher at the University of Eastern Finland with her research interests including socio-ecological transformations and justice, relationality, decoloniality, and degrowth. So it's a great pleasure to introduce her, and we look forward to your presentation, Sabaheta. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. Okay, so I will talk today about the EU bioeconomy in relations to two quite polarized, yet both potential realities. On the one side, the green growth, domination, and coloniality, and on the other side, the existing movements, hopes, and, well, despair or urgency for changing the course toward more just decolonial and post-growth pathways and futures. I will also cover some of the barriers for such transformations, as well as openings that are emerging from the cracks of the current system of growth and domination that is, I think, falling apart. My presentation is in the context of the EU bioeconomy policy, yet it is in that global context that it is positioned, and it's based on a 5-year fellowship project that ended in September last month, which is called Justice and Politics in Global Bioeconomy, or Just Globe. Next slide, please. So now you should be seeing the content of the talk. I will focus on these three things. First, it will be a bit about the framings of the EU bioeconomy policy and strategies with some of the dynamics that have been happening over the years. And then, as I said, the barriers and the radicalization or co-optation of transformative ideas and concepts that happen by design. And then, as I said, again, some of these emerging openings and pathways rooted in relational, decolonial, feminist, post-growth and care-centered theories and praxis. And I'm very well aware that these different approaches are sometimes even in tensions between each other, but I keep telling them all because I think they are all very relevant and inform alternatives beyond growth and beyond coloniality and injustices. Next slide. So here is, we start with the first point, the framing. So since its inception, which is, I think, now already 15 years ago, the EU bioeconomy has been framed and positioned as substitution of fossil to bio, gray to green economy and growth, and the whole techno-scientific innovations that would need to get the EU there. So both of these aspects, the substitution and then the innovations, they strive to ensure economic growth for the EU. And I keep stressing that because really that's like the other, what this means for other communities and natures and peripheries, that's always less of a priority. And there is, yeah, the economic growth and the EU competitiveness being some of the major aims. Okay, of course, justice and fairness and even sufficiency have, came out and featured in the policy discourses. Mostly though, especially the sufficiency hasn't made it yet to any official policy documents on the EU bioeconomy. And they are kind of presented as add-ons rather than design principles, which would hopefully, even though it's not so straightforward if you put it there, but it's more likely, right, to be achieved rather than, putting it as this needs to be taken care of and frame it and recognize, but then in the measures and funding documents, decisions, for instance, they are mostly absent. And yes, there are minimal distributional justice aspects that are integrated in the last and about to be replaced EU bioeconomy strategies. but they are limited to EU job security, so for EU citizens, and mostly it's about the economic burdens and not much other things like recognition, knowledge, domination, global domination, and so on. So if there are two bioeconomy visions, as sometimes it is said, so the growth first versus planetary limits and justice, the EU bioeconomy policy is definitely in the first one. And yes, there are this is a dynamic process. So Europe's bioeconomy narrative quickly has been shifting. The first strategy has been mostly about this technology and efficiency and growth through that, with justice being really kind of marginalized. Then in 2018, the new strategy and the current one has opened up those lenses to include biodiversity concerns and where is the supply coming from, and aiming to be more, EU would be more self-sufficient, and local jobs were discussed, again, mostly in the framing, but in practice, it's still really organized. The policy is organized, and policy action is around, scaling industries and boosting competitiveness. Now there is the leaked 2025 draft of the EU bioeconomy strategy that is really taking us 50 years back, or even, it's very much reflecting the geopolitics and industrial rivalry with the China and US, and competitiveness language is all over. So yeah, I just want to click now next, please. I want to say that I am aware that this sounds like, very doom and just negative points. And I want to say that it is not just my opinion that I am saying for the fun of it. There have been quite a lot of papers in the last 5 years from our project, and of course from many others. And I have here taken 3 that perhaps most directly talk to this framing and the dynamics of the EU bioeconomy, so the things that I have said so far. So those are the links to the 3 papers, but in the interest of time, let's move on. Next slide, please. So you should see now the deradicalizing by design slide. If not, just say the word and we can check that. But I will now next get a little bit more in depth about how this change without the change. So all these dynamics, yes, we are doing something but not really doing anything, and so on, gets institutionalized. And this is based on a recent book chapter that is, you've seen the name of the chapter, it's in the recently published book on socio-ecological transformations, which I edited with 15 other chapters in it. So the chapter, this one, is based on 12 semi-structured interviews with the European Commission Brussels-based policy officers who are working on various sectors and aspects of bioeconomy. And it's also based on a 2-day workshop with 22 participants and the discussions that took place there. So if you click, then you will see the cooptation. So this is the results of this fieldwork where I am arguing that there is the transformative terms like degrowth, justice, decolonial justice, transformations were really absorbed and softened in the policy narratives and dissolved in the policy measures. So it's a kind of case of policy absorption that preserve core growth logics. So for instance, transformations, when you discuss what does this mean, it's mostly about this green, what we in literature would call green transition to green capitalism and growth. Degrowth is taboo. There are many other words that were suggested because degrowth was such a taboo word, but sustainable consumption perhaps was the closest, the one that some interviewees and participants in workshops were comfortable with, but it is not something that has made it so far in the official policy documents. And then just shortly about what I mean by recolonizing with the will to improve. When we discuss the socio-ecological costs and injustices on the other communities and peripheries and natures across the majority worlds or global south, it was sort of like, we do understand this, we do know it, but we have to do this, and we will, compensate for all the lost. And this is basically very much colonial approach to how we compensate for our way of thinking or doing. Okay, then next, not next slide, but just a click to say about some barriers. So there were about 10 barriers identified that people themselves, the interviewees, were telling. And I put here the first 5. So the policy hierarchy, wherein it's really hard to make any, to bring any new concepts or new ideas from the lower level policy officers upwards, because they are left out. There is also the science policy interface that is very much cryptic, because what they consider to be very complex or sensitive issues, like talking about degrowth or decoloniality, it's basically filtered out, and the policy decision makers, they don't have so much time, so they request very quick messages and quick fixes and all this kind of like nitty-gritty stuff. Corporate lobbying was extremely important, second in how many people talked about it. And then the reputational risks of being labeled as radical communist and being left out from the circles and the hierarchy of the policy making. Sectoral and silo working, culture of the commission, so with all the DGs and people don't understanding each other when they come together to work. And the geopolitics war and the growth of China was not named as a barrier by themselves, but when I listen to what they are talking about, how they justify the current ways, is very much obvious that it's rooted in this fear of what is going otherwise on. Next slide. So I just want to quickly point out here, without too much going on in details, that there are many other EU policy initiatives, especially those that they are like what I call international or external governance, like in these 2 papers. If you click once more, then there should be, and once more, so that you get the content of those 2 papers. Basically, like in the case of the EU DR, or EU Deforestation-Free Products Regulation, which we look through a radical transformation lens. And then the other paper is about more broadly about how EU is in the last 15 years is being handling the deforestation footprint in tropical countries. We see similar positions and approaches like what I've so far talked about. And if you click once more, there should be you should see the reoccurring barriers across different EU green bioeconomy policy cases. So the same things: growth logic, growth first logics, technosolutionism, justice treated as a ticking of a box, and knowledge hierarchies, sidelining other ways of knowing, indigenous and local knowledges. For the kind of techno-scientific knowledge, and institutional lock-ins and so on. So just to sort of say that it's not like an issue of one strategy or one policy. Next slide. So what does this mean? What does it mean to approach the bioeconomy from a different perspective, from all this, what I was talking about, openings from the different logics or different worldviews: relational, decolonial, feminist, multi-species, post-growth, and justice-centered. I have focused more on some than others, but I have also worked with other colleagues who are more familiar with decolonial or feminist perspectives. But basically, I want to say that starting by recognizing, like, this is a minimal, to recognize that biomass is not a neutral feedstock for energy, but it is the life itself. It's a relation. It's a complex socio-ecological relation, and asking different questions. So if you click, we will see some of the questions that have been informing my own research from all these different perspectives that I mentioned. So talking about relations, about power, about the EU colonial history and its neo-colonial domination. Some of the key questions I would read here is whose bodies and labor are treated as resources, while which more than human lives are reduced to extractable matter, whose worldviews and knowledges are shaping policy and whose are excluded, yet it is mostly those whose worldviews and knowledges are excluded who are burdened by those policies. So this talks to the injustices of epistemic and ontological injustices. The former talks is a perspective from a feminist lens when you ask such questions, recognizing and addressing again the EU neo-colonial dependence and dominance, and also its which would then bring the discussion of reparations for present and past injustices and domination from economic to other ontological and epistemic, recognizing and confronting ontological, epistemic justice. So next slide. So once we shift gears and look at these things differently, what does this mean more concretely? What could it mean without trying to really prescribe any solutions to the issue? But we are often, as critical social scientists, we are often branded as just a pessimist, and what is your solution is always asked. So while I don't want to give any solutions, in this paper we have tried directly to address how the shift away from the current logics could happen, drawing on the different perspectives. So we first trace some of the root causes behind the extractivism and injustices that we are discussing here in the context of EU bioeconomy, highlighting in particular well, if we want to go the other way around from the more specific to broader, the economic growth imperative, which Sabrina was very much addressing in her talk, but also the colonial power relations and the neo-colonial as well, and the anthropocentrism and commodification of life as a kind of still deeper underlying layer. So we discuss those, and then we turn to the perspectives that have been largely sidelined in the EU policy debates, so the feminist, the colonial, relational approaches that foreground interconnectedness, care, multi-species justice, knowledge sovereignty. And we ask, if we took this seriously, what would bioeconomy look like? So we propose a so-called flower of change, which you hopefully can read these 11 action points, under which 47 recommendations for decision makers and researchers alike to help imagine bioeconomy as a project grounded in care and justice and well-being could happen. So let's move on to the other slide, because there are some tables that are still related to this flower. So in the other slide, you will see here is only one of the 11 action points. So redefining human-nature relations based on relational approaches and multi-species justice. So these 11 points, they are in the paper placed in supplementary materials, and it's like quite a lot of pages. So each one is then opened up with some kind of suggestions or sometimes examples that go to that direction. Like you can here see, like we have under the educational and cultural routes, alluding to different possibilities, self-reflexive psychological routes, or contemplative maybe routes, or knowing, reflecting on our own self and what are our relations with the rest of nature and so on. So then another slide, next slide, is again, I've just put this 11 action in the table with a one-line description. I think I could give you a few seconds to read through, and I am anyway having 1 minute or so or less. So these are just, perhaps we can open up some of them if you want to ask in the debate, but yeah, the idea was never to go through each of them, just to hopefully get your attention If you haven't, one more click for the next 5 actions. And yeah, the idea being just to get your attention if you want to check out that paper, if you're interested. So next slide with thank you. And if you have any questions, quick questions, I'm here to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sabaheta. Lots of food for thought there. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, and I actually really am looking forward to reading that paper too. Thank you so much. So again, please hold your questions and we will come to them at the end, but for now, we're going to move on to our last presentation, which is from Dr. Jessica Lavelle. So Jessica is a researcher and policy analyst with a background in ecology, conservation, human geography. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Cape Town in the Bioeconomy Research Chair, and she convenes the Post-Growth Fellowship at the Post-Growth Institute, exploring economic alternatives to capitalism. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Yeah, so following on from the other 2 presentations, I am going to be swinging us to the south, situated in South Africa, and looking at sort of the bioeconomy here and how it's framed, and looking at some of the challenges and problems within those framings, and then moving on to how we could think about the bioeconomy slightly differently. Next slide, please, Steph. All right, so South Africa is quite interesting because we've taken a divergent approach to how we frame the bioeconomy. So there's actually 2 elements to it here. So we have the bioeconomy, and then we also have something called the biodiversity-based economy. But of course, both of these fall under the umbrella of nature-based solutions. All right, but these 2 different approaches have different institutional homes and policy origins, and they've got divergent conceptual foundations and development imaginaries. So if we look at the bioeconomy, that falls under the mandate of Department of Science, Technology and Innovation. And really the main idea around the bioeconomy under this framing is harnessing biological resources for national economic competitiveness through science, innovation and industrialization. So it takes a strong growth imperative, and the knowledge base is really around scientific and technological innovation. And key industries underneath this, of course, would be things like agricultural biotechnology, looking at GM crops. So South Africa's got quite a robust industry around GM maize, cotton and soybean. And then there's also a big umbrella around pharmaceutical research and development. And that would be looking at vaccines. We've got a branch of Indigenous medicine research and development. There's also sectors around biofuels that are just nascent but developing. And then also looking at things like enzymes and bioplastics. All right, so the policy origin around this is really drawing quite heavily from the EU. We heard from Sabaheta around the EU's framing of the bioeconomy. And so South Africa's bioeconomy has sort of imported this and is along the same line. We have the National Bioeconomy Strategy with a revision that's currently underway, and we also have a national framework. So on the other side of this, we have the biodiversity-based economy, and it's different in that it's housed by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, and it's really centered around the sustainable use of biodiversity to empower communities and also to achieve conservation objectives, so achieving equity and conservation together. And the idea is to do this through rights-based development, equitable benefit sharing under access and benefit sharing, and through community-based enterprises. All right, so the knowledge base here is slightly different because it's more focused on Indigenous and local knowledge. And key industries here are sort of a lot of the plant-based industries. So we have a big rooibos industry, pelargonium for the production of phytomedicines. Then we also have things like marula, and other things that are also included under the biodiversity-based economy is our wildlife economy, which is very robust and growing. That sort of centers around ecotourism, and then also the production of game meat, which they're really looking to scale up. So the policy origins of the biodiversity-based economy is the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Nagoya Protocol around access and benefit sharing. And I saw there was a question around access and benefit sharing, which I was interested to see in the chat. So here we focus on biotrade, bioprospecting, And where do these two bioeconomies intersect? Well, both of them do include an element of bioprospecting and access and benefit sharing. So of course, with the bioeconomy, a lot of that R&D is dependent on genetic resources, bioprospecting of the genetic resources, which would then be commercialized and scaled. Right. And the valorization of biodiversity is both included under both of these framings. So both see biodiversity as a source of value, but the value is different in how it's defined and distributed. Both of them also are seeking to promote the transformation in South Africa from, into a post-colonial society, and also become more inclusive in terms of its development. But they're doing it with different ways. So different mechanisms. Obviously, with the bioeconomy, it's more around industrial participation. So really pushing for GDP growth, and then versus community benefit sharing, which would be under the biodiversity-based economy. Okay, next slide. So what is the commonality within these two? Well, both of them are operating within the capitalist framework. All right, so both of them are prioritizing growth, modification of nature and knowledge, and profit. So why is this a challenge? Well, South Africa is seeking transformation in a system that ultimately perpetuates coloniality, as growth and profits are both dependent on the exploitation of cheap resources and labor. So there's a structural tension there. The other problem is that these metrics and market valuation tools for growth are focused on things like the numbers of jobs created and the volumes traded. And as Sabahita mentioned, this reduces the complex social-ecological relations that are really existing at a local level, reduces them to numbers with not enough attention given to indicators of well-being, things like care, equity, autonomy. So if you'll see some of I've just put in there an excerpt from the draft National Biodiversity Economy Strategy, and you can see how it's very focused on GDP growth. And Sabrina, did explain and talk to you really nicely around how using GDP as a single metric alone really is problematic. The other picture there is just showing how this idea of wanting to really grow some of our biodiversity-based industries. For example, there's a projection of the rooibos market that really is focused on increasing production and consumption. These imported sustainability frameworks, such as nature as capital and green growth and market-led sustainable development, they are not homegrown. So we are definitely still leaning onto northern frameworks rather than sort of like looking at what can we create more locally that speaks to our values and principles here in South Africa. All right, so moving on to the third slide. Wanted to drill down a little bit more into the bioeconomy and the biodiversity economy and some of the limitations of how we framed within capitalism. So if we look at the bioeconomy, it inherently rewards those who own technology, infrastructure, and intellectual property. And obviously, South Africa has made huge advances in our biotech capabilities. However, we still are dependent on northern patents and research collaborations. We don't have a lot of the infrastructure that's needed, and we are still reliant on trying to get equipment. So we haven't yet, brokered those equal ground in terms of competing with the North, which means that what can happen here is that our biotech firms operate as subcontractors to more powerful Northern partners. If we look at the biodiversity-based economy, it's really focused on trying to empower communities, but what we're seeing is that there's actually limited community empowerment and procedural justice. And at the moment, it's sort of focusing on participation and not true transformation. A lot of that is linked to the economic structure, right? So we've got user-provider lock-in. If we look at a lot of the industries, both within the biodiversity-based economy, we're seeing that it's predominantly for export. So as long as we're having to export, we're bound by those we're bound by what the user demands. And if we look at access and benefit sharing, there's a problem there because we're seeing that ABS is becoming compliance, a box ticking exercise rather than enabling true transformation at a local level. Then if we look at the colonial relations, so this is still really defining South Africa's post-apartheid political economy. So instead of transforming, it's reproducing those existing power relations. If we look at the biodiversity-based economy, communities are still frequently lacking land rights. Ownership of land is highly problematic. It's very skewed due to apartheid, with most of the land being owned by big white commercial farmers. And I'm going to go into a couple of examples now with rooibos and honeybush. And this generates problems for market access as well. We look at our communities, they're really struggling to access capital and technology. It's really skewed again along racial lines. And decision-making power is still held by the state and driven by the market. So what we see is that ABS agreements tend to be more symbolic rather than enabling structural inclusion. Similarly, if we look at the bioeconomy, I said they're the colonial division of biolabor, we have fantastic scientists in South Africa. But what we're doing is we're supplying the biodiversity and the skilled scientists, but we'll see the global firms are actually capturing that surplus value through the intellectual property and market control. So we're still seeing that division of labor and division of value. I think we are aware, somebody just mentioned as well, Sabrina, the risk of greenwashing under the bioeconomy. If we're looking at industrial agriculture, if we're looking at biofuels, we can see that those are actually highly dependent on monocultures and plantations, which have huge ecological impacts, which are not taken into consideration. And if we look at the biodiversity-based economy, if we're reliant on the capitalist framework, it's increasing production and consumption, which means either increasing the impact on wild harvested populations of plants or otherwise increasing areas of cultivated lands, neither of which have positive ecological impacts. And then just looking at those epistemic foundations, the differences I've already spoken to, they're these big north-south inequalities, and we still have this dominance of private intellectual property rights. I think a whole separate presentation needs to be done on data sovereignty and intellectual property rights, and how do we restructure these under the post-growth paradigm. But what we are seeing is that there is still marginalization, certainly within the biodiversity-based economy, or inadequate recognition of Indigenous and traditional knowledge, even with ABS principles in place. All right, and we're still seeing that dominance of private IPRs. And what's so difficult is where we've got intellectual property rights over certain value chains, it's really difficult to change those now and to restructure them. So unless there is market willingness, all right, and that is something that's a key barrier to change at the moment. Right, and do we really want to, I think that's important to a question, do we really want to continue to extract and purely instrumentalize Indigenous and traditional knowledge as data, rather than recognizing it as living practice, collective heritage? This ongoing sort of valuation of Indigenous and traditional knowledge is risky when it's only supported if it has marketable value and then otherwise ignored. So that reproduces a kind of epistemic extractivism. Right, so moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to talk to, because my research is sort of more focused, or our research in the chair is more focused on the biodiversity-based economy. I wanted to look at some examples of how this is actually playing out in reality. The rooibos is probably our biggest industry, and this is where Rachel has done a lot of her research. And so what we've seen with rooibos is that there has been huge growth in the industry over the last 2 decades. All right, so the amount of production has actually tripled, and we've seen that the cultivated area, land area has at least doubled. All right, so rooibos is produced in a very sensitive ecosystem. It's a very small area north of Cape Town in the Cedarburg. This is part of Fynbos biome, and there's high biodiversity there. And so when we see these increasing areas of cultivated land, it's actually reducing biodiversity overall, even though rooibos is planted as a biodiversity-friendly commodity. So I think this needs to be careful about understanding when we're shifting from, biodiverse industries to something that's sort of more monoculture, plantation oriented, we have to look at those ecological impacts more critically. Then, as I said, within South Africa, we've got these huge challenges because both our bioeconomy and our biodiversity-based economy is really tied into the post-apartheid political economy. We still need a lot of structural transformation, which hasn't happened. So if we look at rooibos, it's very skewed between the white commercial farmers and the small-scale Indigenous or coloured farmers. So there you've got less than 10 farmers when processes that are controlling the majority of the industry. And then if you actually look at the small-scale Indigenous farmers, who are the traditional knowledge owners, that's about 2%. All right, and there's differences in how they are supported and their ability to access capital technology. When it came to the access and benefit sharing agreement, there were problems in terms of who got to participate. It definitely favored those who were politically powerful and well organized. And as a result, what ended up happening was those small-scale Indigenous farmers have ended up having to pay towards the benefit sharing as well as receiving the benefit sharing. So it's turned out in a very roundabout way, and the benefit sharing has actually turned out to be rather minimal. Even though it looks like a huge amount, when it has to be diluted and diffused, and you look at how those benefit distribution is flowing, it actually comes down to a very minimal benefit, which doesn't really enable transformation. Right, so if we look at the next example, which is around honeybush. All right, so here we have some of the similar issues. If we look at honeybush, a lot of it, honeybush occurs on white-owned land. And so you'll have harvesters that are needing to access these lands by acquiring permits from the white landowners. All right, so there's this sort of forced subordination to regulatory compliance in the first place to get those permits. And then this real struggle to access to income because of having to go through other channels and not having sovereignty and autonomy over their own land. There's also, within the honeybush industry, there isn't yet a benefit sharing agreement in place. This is in process. But again, it's not sure to see how these negotiations are going to work out. One of the challenges with ABS is that it is very technocratic and legalistic, and that is really difficult for communities to access and to participate in fully. The other issue is that there's this continued erasure of Indigenous and traditional knowledge. In terms of those traditional knowledge holders, in terms of the honeybush holders who have held onto this knowledge and have stewarded the knowledge and still practice that knowledge are not being recognized. And this is one of the key tenets of ABS, has not yet happened in the honeybush industry. There's also a push for large-scale cultivation of land, but this, cultivation of honeybush, and it seeks to sort of expand the way that Black and coloured communities can access honeybush. However, as with rooibos, it's the same problem in terms of if we radically increase the cultivation, then we have risks around ecological damage. But then also, how does one make that land cultivable? It requires access to land in the first place, which requires the restructuring of land ownership, but then also resources and capital and technology. So these are just some of the issues that I wanted to highlight in terms of the biodiversity-based economy is truly seeking to be an inclusive development agenda and seeking to be transformational. But because of the capitalist framing and because capitalism is inherently tied to our history of colonialism and apartheid, we're not seeing this structural change. All right, so moving on to some ideas around how can we shift this? What is needed? So one of the things that is really trying to understand how do we define transformation? And it's the same way that with different framings of the bioeconomy is how transformation is framed. At the moment, transformation is still predominantly the idea or the framing of transformation is still predominantly being led by the state. And it's still being led by, as I said, these metrics around income generation or job creation alone. But justice means so much more than that. It means the restoring of dignity and self-determination and sovereignty over land, over resources, and over knowledge. So as long as we're having market capture of these things, we're not going to see that true transformation. Similarly, true transformation really arises from community-defined priorities rather than coming from top-down development plans. The state is still predominantly driving development agendas, and so this would need to change. There would need to be a lot more community participation, and not just symbolic participation, but true participation, where communities or the resource owners and traditional knowledge owners actually get to drive what is the agenda of their own development, and local knowledge systems and principles and values really guiding decision making and innovation. I think we also have a tendency to not recognize this. The innovation is sort of only recognized if it's scientific and technological innovation. And yet there is so much innovation within Indigenous traditional knowledge that is ignored, that is relevant to the biodiversity-based economy. And looking at some of the linkages, so for example, under the bioeconomy, we have a strong focus on, for example, industrial agriculture, but then there's a whole other component around agroecology, and how could the biodiversity-based economy better support agroecology and vice versa. So there you'd be really nurturing these multi-species relations, but also social ecological justice. I want to touch on what Sabrina was mentioning around exnovation. I think South Africa would do well to look at where some of our policies are failing and to see failure as feedback. I think it was also posited as creative failure. And I think that's a really lovely way to look at it and to think about it, that policy failures are opportunities for learning and for unlearning. And that's okay. Of course, policy and legislation is really expensive to develop and implement, but we can't just keep going down the same road and kicking the can down the road if it's not working. So I think this idea of exnovation is really powerful. And this idea, and really looking at how can we deliberately discontinue harmful or exclusionary policies and systems. All right, so one I'm going to just throw up here, which has come up under Honeybush, for example, is permitting systems. Questioning, are permitting systems for access to biodiversity really serving the purpose that they're meant to serve, which is around protecting sustainability, or are they causing more exclusionary harm to those that are meant to benefit from biodiversity in the first place? All right, so that would be an example of just looking at perhaps permits need to be exnovated altogether, or maybe there's a way to re-innovate them. But just allowing that space to be able to really question and see if there are possibilities for where we can phase out those things that are not working. A very confrontational point in South Africa, but something that is so necessary, is the need for the recognition and confrontation of white supremacy. That's such a confrontational term for many people here, but it really is underpinning some of our major issues around transformation and we need epistemic and land justice in the country. We cannot ignore the fact that there are structural, racial, and epistemic hierarchies that are continuing to shape access and participation within both the bioeconomy and the biodiversity economy. So we cannot move forward without having some kind of land restitution and recognition of these other epistemologies that exist in the country, but not only if they're marketable. All right, so it has to be beyond the market. And then there's the democratization of value chains. So here we're talking about who has the power over production, processing, and trade, and this really needs to shift from corporate and state elites down to the community level. Sabrina did mention some of Hinton's work. So there she looks at and Sabrina spoke to her own work around post-growth enterprises. What do these look like? Key element here is it has to be not-for-profit, not meaning that you're not generating income, you are, but how is that income reinvested in society and the environment? And there needs to be an increase in focus on relocalization of economies, or at least looking at how can we increase SADC trade, how can we increase trade within the AU. We're hugely dependent on our export economy and exporting to the EU, but of course this ties us in and locks us in. And then lastly, just looking at the rejection of imported sustainability frameworks and rather considering how can we have pluriversal approaches. So recognizing that there are a multitude of different worldviews, different ecological realities and modes of living. And I think it's very important to understand that the market itself is not the problem. It's how the market is structured. And so looking at these alternative ways of structuring the market and structuring economies. All right, so there's lots of exciting research that's been emerging. Frederico de Moreira, Hartland and Nell, Hinton, Arturo Escobar, Ashish Kothari. There's many different approaches that have been coming out of, I think, India, and also our colleagues in Latin America. If we look at places like Ecuador, are really trying to push the paradigm into these alternatives. So I'm going to stop there in aid of time, and so we can have some time to move to questions. But I think the important thing is, like Sabrina said, is to remain positive and hopeful. So looking at these challenges, but going, yes, there are alternatives, and how can we think about these creatively and make them visible? Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. And thanks to all three speakers for such great inputs. And I think you can see from the chat that it's provoking a lot of really interesting conversations. So let's start with some of those questions. And please, if anyone would prefer just to raise their hand and ask a question in person or online so we can see your face, that would also be very appreciated. So please just raise your hand if you wish to do that. But let's start with a question for Sabrina from Vera Joro. Many EU countries have restrictions on advertising products with negative social impacts like alcohol and tobacco. So they ask what's needed for similar restrictions to be applied to other products that impact, for example, on the quality of air, water, soil, and so on. Sabrina?
Let me just start saying that lots of these questions are great, and I don't claim that I have a proper response to all of them, but I think it's very context dependent, right? Because it depends what we want to ban or phase out or reduce, and at which level of governance. For example, if we want to reduce advertisement from public buses or public transport, then that might be here in Australia regulated by city councils. Well, if it's at the national level, there are restrictions about maybe imports or exports of certain products, and that has again another set of regulation and lobbies and dynamics to it. But I moved to the University of Sydney recently from CSIRO. I was working for Australian National Science Agency, and I'm learning a lot, for example, from my public health scholars about the challenges to reducing or protecting people from ultra processed food and other similar products, because they're like international state disputes. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, has to safeguard some trade agreements. So sometimes corporation right to trade overcomes public health objective at the national level. So I think there's a lot of dynamics in there that needs to be probably per country or per product be studied, and then to strategize around the potential barriers that exist.
Thank you, Sabrina. There are a couple of questions that are similar. Well, there are two that are quite similar. So I'm going to read them out and ask for all speakers just to give a brief response to them. So the one question is about, they're both really around the practical implementation of these ideas. The one from Eva Dryden asks how post-growth and degrowth frameworks can be applied fairly in countries that have historically been denied opportunities for economic growth through colonization. I think there's even a little bit of an interesting critique there of the way that question's asked. Could global South countries see degrowth as a Western Eurocentric concept? So is there a question here around equity and justice in its application? And then I think a related question is from Pierre, always comes with a nice challenging question. Pierre asks, Pierre Duplessis, given high rates of urbanization, especially in the global South and informal settlements, how would degrowth deal with this hump of urban poor people who are increasingly separated from nature? So are there other kinds of models, alternative growth models, rather than degrowth? Impacts of climate change on food and AI and jobs suggest large-scale problems, and we need to do more. So they're quite similar questions, and I'd love a short response from each of the panelists to those questions. Sabeta, maybe you could go first. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, about the first question, I really welcome them. And even though my own research has really, like, I've been so excited about the growth and so on, but uh, there are emerging uh, perspectives which really echo the importance of the question, right? Like, what does this mean for the global South or majority worlds, given the context of coloniality and so on? So I think I wouldn't say as a yes or no. Yes, we should consider it as a colonial and one more epistemic imposition of global north to global south, or no, we shouldn't. It really depends, like, how we want to. If the growth is really forced, as I hope it won't be to such a big extent, right? If it's currently discussed, as at least from Jason Hickel and the scholars that I echo with, is discussed as look, we are talking about degrowing of the global north, where we have the most pressure of natural resources and most consumption and so on. And at the same time recognizing that a lot of these ideas, the sufficiency, the living in line in harmony with the rest of nature, are actually based in indigenous and local knowledges of the people from Latin America, current Latin America, but the Aterea in the African context. And so, like, or Mahatma Gandhi is often referred as even the poets, and like, okay, so there are a lot of these ideas that are emerging from, not from the global north. We can say that they inspire the degrowth that we know of now. And in relation to the second question, which was about if there is another term that we could discuss, I would bring attention to the relational worldviews or relational ontological positions, where we do not see the human as separate from nature, but really as one of the forms of and expressions of life and manifestation of life, which are, of course, like we present them here a little bit like new, or they sound like new to people who are scholars who start to deal with them, but all of them are older than the empire. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabaita. Are there any other views on those two questions from either Jess or Sabrina?
Maybe Jess, you can go first, because I think it's more appropriate coming from a South African perspective.
Yeah, I think the question of degrowth and issues around equity between the North and the South comes up often. And I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about degrowth, we're talking about degrowing harmful industries. So, and how that applies within each of our different countries. So I'm just going to pick on South Africa for an example. We do have a huge focus, for example, on expanding our mining industry, but we are not seeing social and ecological justice within this expansion, obviously. And so if we were talking about degrowth within South Africa, we would be questioning, how do we degrow an industry such as mining, which is reproducing exclusionary harms that originate under colonialism and were perpetuated by apartheid? How do we degrow that industry and look at focusing on how do we grow alternative industries that better support social ecological justice? All right. Again, as I said, it's very contentious, because we see that mining contributes, for example, hugely to GDP, and people would argue that that then goes to taxes, which then enables people to benefit from those public sector provision. But I think it's just really it's important to not for us not to think that degrowth means degrowing everything. And I think Sabaita spoke about how within the EU there is the problem of overconsumption. All right, so within the EU it's around reframing things as sufficiency. In South Africa, we do not have sufficiency in many areas of our society. So yes, there we need to increase efficiency. So it's really about understanding those nuances within the degrowth framework. It's going to look very different in different countries and in different places and in different societies. I just wanted to also quickly jump onto Pierre's question, which was around urbanization, and I think this is a critical point. I think what we can look at is how do we apply post-growth principles within urban environments. There could be policy emphasis on looking at urban food gardens. There could be policy emphasis on sustainable transport solutions. There could be emphasis on, I see you put there on there's the AI. I think we're still seeing how that's going to unfold. And then we look at how I think we've become so used to if we look at sort of these ideas around sufficiency and shared resources, I think Sabrina spoke to the Brisbane Tool Library. So, for example, how could we still facilitate access, but to different resources but enabling that in a way that is not so consumptive, so that it becomes more affordable and there is access, but it's not driven on increasing consumption. So those are just some ideas that I have there, but I'm going to pass over to Sabrina because, it's already 23 past.
No, I just wanted to add to what Jessica said, it's not about, degrowing every sector or every activity. It's about, selecting that. But also, it's not up to me today to say, what global south, emerging, economies want to need to do. But one thing that I want to point out at is that in order to have a growth-driven economy, we need to exploit labor and the environment somewhere else. So the only way, even if we assume that all global south countries want to grow, the only way to do that is for global north countries to not keep exploiting labor and environment in these countries to begin with. So the condition of growth are not there, and that's why there's this divergent development pathway that we see between global north and global south countries.
Thank you all. Yeah, really interesting. There's a question about the work of the UN on beyond GDP. I don't know if anyone is interested in responding to that particular question. How does this relate to that? How's what's discussed today relate to the work of the UN?
Yeah, I can just briefly respond to that. So there are alternative indicators, as I said, that capture, indicators and dashboards. So, alternative exists. The problem is not about, changing from one indicator to the other. Is the actual political economy behind the indicator that remains the barrier. And I know from colleagues that work in this space, including with the UN, that if, for example, we start changing indicators of prosperity, we might see countries like Costa Rica and others at a very, ranking very high, while, countries such as the US and so on might be very low. And that would actually open up really interesting conversation about international order. And as we can see in these turbulent geopolitical times, changing international orders and power dynamic is very, it can be chaotic and challenging. So it's not a lack of other indicators that is stopping this transition. It's more the political economy at the treasury level in countries, but also at the international level.
Thank you so much, Sabrina.
I just wanted to add to that just quickly. Yeah, I think with the SDGs is a really the UN is a really interesting one, because if we look at the SDGs, economic growth is still included. I think it's goal 8. So I think there's a tension there between, sort of beyond GDP and how do we measure prosperity, but then still being underpinned by this objective of economic growth. So as you're saying, you can change the metrics, but unless you're changing what's behind it and what's driving that objective of the metrics, there's still going to be a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Beheta Pingperia, who I've known for many years, and it's so nice to see him here, is asking about your flower and whether there are ways to sort of sequence the arrangement of the flowers, I suppose. So there would be some kind of transitional arrangement, so one could see a gradual realization of the goals. Have you done some of that thinking?
I read the paper, the question. Now I cannot find it, but well, what I was gonna say is that I completely understand where it is coming from, but also as someone who has been knowing that these ideas are not at all, again, repeating perhaps myself, are not new. We have, at least for the 50 years, with the systems change and with Meadows' work, known that, okay, this is not the way to go. So I would perhaps a little bit like resist against this, say that, oh, let's do a more transitionist way, because that's just, buy time and give time to the elites and these approaches that we have been critiquing here, which is why I think we should talk the hard way, because it's, again, like Jessica and Sabrina have said, it's not about that there is no alternative. This is not known. Everything would be ready to use if there was shift in really what our objectives are with the economies and with general. It's not just economy, but the way we want to live and the way we want to exist as society, global society.
Yeah, thank you. We've got time for one last question before we wrap up. We've just got one or two more minutes from Carla, who is asking about what Sabrina said regarding the focus of innovation over phasing out of the problematic, and asking whether this needs to be led by the local level or if there's any hope of global consensus on doing this. It's quite a broad question. Perhaps in responding to this question, you could also just have some concluding remarks for the webinar, because I think it is to that level. Thank you.
Yeah, I will wrap it up here, but the short answer is I don't think that we have the privilege anymore to be selecting from, where to start change. I think, from wherever we are, top down, bottom up, let's just, really take the alarming trends seriously. In terms specifically on innovation, when we had the problems with the ozone layers, the Montreal Protocol had specific exnovation phase outs of ozone depleting substances, and countries came together and acted together and protected the ozone layer. So that is a successful case of exnovation. Contrary, the Paris Agreement, and there's a paper that analyzed it, had no mention of exnovation at all. So there was mention of increasing renewable energies and so on, but there was no mention of phasing out fossil fuels, resources and energy sources. So then that came into the conversation, more recently, but that shows how we frame international agreements or, even local policy documents can influence what, which kind of exnovation might be implemented or not.
Thank you. Sabaheto or Jess, any concluding remarks?
Sorry, my phone is so buzzing. I don't know. Perhaps that I want to invite the people who are the attendees to continue thinking that we can do better, and to continue being active in any of their capacities, in their capacities, whether they are teachers, then talking with the students, whether they are activists or researchers, to really do our parts, what we can to undo and unlearn the injustices of the current state where we are. As much as broad that sounds, but I think we can all do a little bit, always more. Thank you.
Yeah, important not to feel powerless as an individual, for sure. Jess?
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate that we already have the solutions. Yeah, so I think that's really, really important, that post-growth possibilities are already here, and we just need to focus on amplifying, spreading the word, being committed to it actually being a possibility. And as Sabrina said, it's not necessarily about global. Is it coming from the global? Is it coming from local? It's wherever we're situated, whether that's within policy-making arenas or in academia or as an activist. that we're coming together and collaborating to spread and amplify these ideas.
Thank you, Jess. And thanks to all the panelists, and thanks so much to the audience as well for a really rich and passion-driven presentations, which I think really were so inspiring for all of us. We are going to have another one probably early next year, so do watch the space and do contact us. There's an email address there and a website if you wish to be part of sort of the mailing list, or if you have any further ideas and want to participate in any way. But have a good day to all of you. And thanks again. Bye-bye.